So I think we can get started. Hello, my name is Pamela Druckerman. I'm coming to you live from Paris, and this is Pandemonium U. We launched 2 months ago at the start of the lockdown in France to offer online classes with experts around the world like the ones coming to you today. If you're not yet on our mailing list, please click the link that Leo, our chat master, will put in the chat right now. That'll let you know about future Pandemonium U classes, of which there are many. These classes are free and open to all, but if you enjoy them, we would urge you to make a donation to a charity we've affiliated with. It's called givedirectly.org. Leo will put that in the chat as well, which, as the name implies, gives money directly to people in poor countries around the world. We're very lucky to have with us today two people who know a lot about the Vatican, a lot more than me. Rachel Donadio was the Rome bureau chief for the New York Times. She covered the papacy, not I've learned the papacy, of Benedict XVI, and she led the New York Times' coverage of the Conclave in 2013, in which Pope Francis was elected. She's now a journalist and a contributing writer at The Atlantic in Paris, which is how I'm lucky to know her. Our guest today, who Rachel will be interviewing, is David Kertzer, who, as many of you know, teaches anthropology and Italian studies at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. And he is the Pulitzer-prize winning author of The Pope and Mussolini. He has been investigating the Vatican's interwar and wartime history for many decades, and he was lucky to be one of the first guest scholars allowed inside the archive in March. If you have questions for David and for Rachel, please put them in chat. They will answer them either during the initial conversation or at the end. We hope this will last about 45 minutes, 45, 50 minutes. So Rachel and David, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela, for the introduction. Hi, David. I'm really excited to be here for this excellent adventure in online learning. So David, we wanted to just give our audience a little bit of an overview of the papacy of Pius XII and how he came to power, what his day job was before he became Pope, and your experience in these archives, which were closed for so many years and were just opened, and you managed to get in, and then the pandemic hit. So yeah, so tell us a little bit. Yeah.
You know, this is something that goes well beyond normal interest in papacies, which can be perhaps limited to specialists and the particularly devout, because Pius XII has attracted so much controversy over the years. And there have been 50 years of pressure to open these archives since the controversy really began half a century ago. So finally, Pope Francis announced a year ago he was authorizing the opening of those archives for the papacy of Pius XII, which goes from 39 to 48 to 58, for this March 2nd. And so I was there along with a handful of other scholars, expectantly waiting as they opened the door, 8:30 in the morning on March the 2nd. And we spent an eager week there before that Friday being informed we're shutting down because of the coronavirus emergency. And they've been shut down since. So it was exciting, but also disappointing. However, there is some news to report, which is just as of yesterday, we learned from the Vatican that they're reopening the archives on the beginning of June. Albeit in reduced form and just for the month before closing them down for the summer. But still, that was a good sign.
That's great.
The story of Pius XII is a story of the Vatican and World War II, the Vatican and the Holocaust, the Vatican and the racial laws. So there are a whole series of delicate subjects that involve this papacy and this period. And with the great interest in what made the Holocaust possible, did the Christian churches, not just the Catholic Church, play any role? What role? These have been very much on many people's minds. In fact, the German hierarchy of the Catholic Church just a couple of weeks ago or so came up with a statement acknowledging responsibility for having given church support to Hitler during the war and asking for asking to apologize for it, to recognize that history. And some of us are concerned that the Vatican hasn't recognized the role it played in leading up to the Holocaust and during the war. And so that's also partly what's at stake here.
David, I'm just curious before you guys move on to the history, did you know where to go? Like, you'd waited so long for these archives to open. Did you know where to go when you sort of walked into the room?
Well, first of all, it turns out there are a number of different archives at the Vatican, and I think I'll have a slide we can show a little bit later to give you some idea of it. The main archive is the one that for centuries was called the Vatican Secret Archive, which the Pope Francis just last October renamed, apparently a secret archive, gave off wrong sort of implication from the Pope's point of view, and so it's been renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive.
But it still has secrets in it.
Still has full of secrets. And it's said that just for the papacy of Pius XII, these papers have just been opened. There's something like 18 million pieces of paper there having to do with that papacy. And they go back, the records go back 1,200 years. So people work in those archives, it's not just working on Pius XII, World War II, they're working on over a millennium of church activities around the world. But there's also a Secretary of State archive, there's the archive of the Holy Office of the Inquisition and other church archives as well. So when you say, what do you do first thing after all of these years, they finally open them, where do you begin? And the other thing is that you need a reservation, you need special permission. They limit how you go about making copies, how much material you can see each day. So working there is really a question of tactics of how to make the most of your time.
Yeah, I think that it would be, I mean, obviously, yeah, the Apostolic Archive covers lots and lots of church history. And I think to help us understand why there's been so much controversy over the wartime archives and the wartime papacy, why don't you just start at the beginning and help us understand who was Pius XII and what, how did he, tell us a little bit about his coming to power in 1939 as being a...
Well, as you see here, there are a few slides we can show that might help people kind of visualize what we're talking about. This just initial slide shows Pius XII's name before becoming Pope was Eugenio Pacelli. And here, just to give you an idea of the kind of drama he faced when he became Pope, just a few months, he becomes Pope in March of 1939. The previous spring, Hitler paid a kind of triumphal visit to Rome and to Italy. There you see Mussolini on one side of Hitler and the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, that short gentleman there, to our right. And as they're saluting one of the many processions celebrating Hitler's arrival into Italy. But the controversy, I think the next slide gives some idea of the controversy that the papacy has provoked. You just put up some images to give you some notion. In the middle there, you see there was a play by a German playwright, Rolf Hochhuth, that came out, I think, in 1963. Which portrayed the Pope as having been silent during the Holocaust, failing to speak out to condemn the mass murder of Europe's Jews. And that's really what set off this whole controversy and set off the demand to open the archives of the Vatican so that the truth of that charge could be determined. Then in 1999, John Cornwell published this book with a very provocative and perhaps misleading title of Hitler's Pope, which I think does not capture, obviously, Pius XII's relationship to the Nazi regime, but it further triggered the polemics over this papacy. At the same time, there had been a large and well-funded effort to make Pius XII a saint, proclaim him a saint. He is the hero, among other things, of the pre-Second Vatican Council, more conservative wing of the Catholics, who see that the church, or think that the church went wrong in making the reforms of the Second Vatican Council.
Which was in the 1960s and kind of brought the church into more, I don't know, kind of modern, for lack of a better word, practice, and that it kind of broke with some past traditions. So
right, it was his successor, Pius XII's successor, who was John the 23rd, proclaimed this Vatican Council from that met over the early 60s, and which, as you say, opened up really the church to modern times with so many reforms, but also reaching out to other religions, including Judaism.
David, I'm just curious, even without the information from these new archives, there was still a lot of evidence showing that this Pope was, what this Pope had done during the war, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of emphasis now, understandably, on the Vatican archives, but we have a huge amount of material already. I've been working on this for years and have tens of thousands of documents from other archives. For one thing, during the war years, where the main controversy lies, we have the reports of all the envoys, the foreign envoys who were lodged or dealing with the Vatican on a daily basis through the war. So the Italian ambassador of the Holy See, the German ambassador of the Holy See, the British and American envoys of the Holy See, the French ambassador of the Holy See, all of they, if you go to those archives, as I've done in these other countries, you see their daily reports of their meetings with the Pope and with the people around the Pope. So really, I see this as kind of jigsaw puzzle. And the Vatican papers are kind of the last piece to put together with all these other pieces to really understand what happened.
And what happened, I mean, obviously, the Vatican was not pleased with the slaughter of the Jews of Europe. But the question is really, what did it know when, and what did or didn't it do to speak out against that? And that is very much a question at the heart of Pius XII. So here we have, here's what led up to Pius XII. So tell us a little bit about, relations between church and state, between the Vatican and the fascist regime, where they kind of mutually used each other a little bit to,
they opened Vatican archives by papacy, and in 2006 they opened the archives for the previous papacy, Pius XI, who was Pope in the 20s and 30s. And this led to this book that I published a few years ago about the relationship between the papacy, the Vatican, and the fascist regime in Italy in the 1920s and 30s. Eugenio Pacelli, who would become Pius XII, was throughout the 1930s the number 2 to his predecessor, to Pius XI. So he's actually a major figure in this earlier book. He plays a very significant role. For one thing, he also was involved in negotiating the Concordat with Hitler shortly after Hitler comes to power in 1933. But I think if you look at the next slide, probably we just briefly the history here of the relationship between the Vatican and the Italian fascist regime. There you see Mussolini with the then Secretary of State, Cardinal Gasparri, as they're signing this historic document, the Lateran Accords, which still govern the relationship between the Vatican and Italy, and they established Vatican City. Some people seem to assume Vatican City was always there. Well, no, it only became a official sovereign entity in 1929 when Mussolini agreed to it with the Vatican. This also was very important for the church because it ended the separation of church and state in Italy, something that the church and the Vatican had long opposed. And it brought all sorts of government benefits to the church. Just a quick historical parenthesis. People think Italy was always there as a country, but Italy, the modern country of Italy, is actually pretty recent. It only began in the second half of the 19th century, and only as a result of the destruction of the Papal States. The Pope until then was also a king, the Pope King, who ruled a big swath of central Italy. So ever since the destruction of the Papal States, the Vatican, until Mussolini in 1929, had officially refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Italian states. This was a very big development. Over the next years, we're now leading up to its eventful 1930s. There's the invasion of Ethiopia, which was backed by the Italian church, although Pope Pius XI was not that happy about it. But then in 1938, we have what would be really the beginning of what, from certain perspectives, leads to the Holocaust, certainly from an Italian perspective, namely the racial laws. I think the next slide gives an image. This is an image which was put into a government-sponsored anti-Semitic magazine in 1938 and shows what the racial laws did. So Mussolini announced, much to the surprise of Italians, not least to Italy's Jews, some of whom previously were actually fascists, they announced that Jews are thrown out of the schools, not just the students, but also the teachers and professors. They're thrown out of the military, out of civil service, and so on. You see some of the elements of the racial laws listed here. These days, some historians say that beginning in 1938 was beginning when Mussolini begins to lose popularity in Italy and begins to have a conflict with the Vatican and the Church. And what I found is the reality is more complicated than that, that Mussolini did not lose much popularity, if any, in 1938 as a result of the anti-Semitic campaign. And Pius XI, however, was not happy with these racial laws, in part because although he had made peace with Mussolini and they had a kind of collaboration going, Pius XI despised Hitler and saw Hitler as a pagan, as an opponent of the Catholic Church and its rights. And so Pius XI began to speak out against this. But the people around him, and this is the story I tell in my earlier book, were worried about doing anything that might jeopardize their good relations with Mussolini, who had, of course, embraced Hitler. And so they tried to keep Pius XI from speaking out publicly against the racial laws. Pius XI then dies in February of 39, so a few months later, and his number two, his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, is then elected, as I think we show on the next slide, becomes the Pope. And he becomes the Pope right after the racial laws in Italy and right before World War II begins with the invasion of Poland a few months later. So this basically, is kind of capsule history of these years leading up to the beginning of World War II.
And a huge turning point. I mean, as you say, many Jews in Italy were members of the fascist party until the tide completely turned with the racial laws. The Mussolini and the Vatican kind of use each other for their own power reasons. And then in that weird period that we'll talk about now, between 38 and 40, things kind of could have gone in different directions. Like, I mean, it wasn't clear where Mussolini was going to take this, but clearly the Vatican played a part in that history.
Yes, so 39, there's the attack launched against Poland at the beginning of September of 39 by the Germans. Mussolini had already signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler. And so the first fear is that Italy was going to immediately join the war. And in fact, Mussolini, who was a big saber rattler, was embarrassed not to be joining the war. So the Pope, the new Pope then, the man you see here, Pius XII, certainly lobbied hard to try to keep Mussolini from bringing Italy into the war. At the same time, the beginnings of criticism of the Pope for his silence during the war actually predate the whole question of the Holocaust and the Jews. They begin in Poland. Poland is, of course, this overwhelmingly Catholic country, and its bishops and cardinals and Catholic lay people were begging the Pope to speak out to denounce the Nazi invasion, and he refused to do so. So if you look, one of the things you find as you start to work in these newly open archives are these appeals from Catholics in Poland for the Pope to speak out.
And why didn't he?
Well, the reason he gave them is it would just make their situation worse. It would anger Hitler against the Catholics in the Church and so on. I think here we're getting already at what also motivates him later, namely two things. One, he is fearful of Hitler and what Hitler could do to the Church. But secondly, he realizes that the great majority of Catholics in Germany and Austria, for that matter, which has now become part of the Reich, are pro-Nazi. And he is afraid that if he attacks the Nazis, he would alienate the German Catholics. So he does not speak out, and
This is is maybe like an obvious point, but did he not see himself as kind of like a person with moral authority who had a humanitarian duty, or was it just all, am I being naive and it's all politics in the Vatican?
Well, of course, this was the argument. If you read, for example, the reports sent by the British envoy to the Holy See, he'll continually lament that the Pope doesn't seem to be recognizing the fact that he does have this moral authority and perhaps a moral obligation to speak out. The Pope didn't see things that way. The Pope, on the one hand, was a rather ascetic, you could say very spiritual person, but he he was also a career diplomat. He had never been a pastor of any church, nor a bishop of any diocese. He had spent his life in the Vatican diplomatic service, including many years as a nuncio in Germany, which he knew very well and was completely fluent in German. So he actually approached these questions from what he took to be his greatest responsibility of being Pope, which is protecting the institutional church.
There's a lot of kind of power, recognizing power and trying to figure out when to work behind the scenes and when to just, speak out. But yeah. Should we go to the next slide?
Let's see so this is interesting because on this picture you see there the papal nuncio. So the nuncio is basically the ambassador from the Vatican, the Pope's ambassador to Germany. This fellow, Cesare Orsenigo, had been appointed nuncio, I think in 1930, so quite a few years before, by Pius XI. He was kept on and kept through the 4 years by Pius XII, even though he was basically an admirer of Hitler. And this is an interesting photo. It's at a reception with Hitler in December 39. The date is significant because I mentioned the war began with the invasion of Poland in the beginning of September of 1939. So this is just a few months after Poland is invaded. And if you read Orsenigo's reports, as I have, he's constantly making excuses for Hitler, even as Hitler is involved in not only, of course, his murderous campaign against the Jews and devastation elsewhere in Europe, but also the church is very concerned that he is closing down churches, taking over church property in many of the occupied territories, and in fact, murdering priests. So this is one of the relationships that we're eager to learn more about through the opening of the archives.
Yeah. And did, I don't know if we'll skip around a little bit, but in your, is that kind of one of the questions at the top of your list that you hope will emerge from these archives? Are there, some things have been opened and some haven't, but is his role kind of a lingering question for you?
Yes, his role, I think, is significant. There's actually a large group, maybe we'll see a picture of German historians interested in this history. Of course, this is what they will particularly focus on. My own main focus has been on the relationship between the Pope and Mussolini and the Italian fascist regime. I think what a lot of people don't understand, they tend to put Mussolini and Hitler together as the two fascist dictators, but from the Pope's point of view, from the Vatican's point of view, they're totally different.
Yeah.
The Italian fascist regime has collaborated with the church, has improved its status, has in fact funding it, and the German regime is pagan, is anti-church from the Vatican point of view. So these are two very different kinds of relationships, and I've been particularly interested. A lot of attention is being paid, of course, to the relationship with Germany and the Nazis, which is understandable, and that's part of my story. But I'm really focusing in particular at the relationship with the Italian fascist regime, the relationship that the Vatican has during World War II.
Because that's something, it's certainly relevant, today. I also think that, you can't understand Italian history if you don't understand Vatican history, but at the same time, the way that, there's a kind of love of authoritarianism a little bit in both the Vatican and in the fascist regime, which is something that you get at in the Pope and Mussolini for sure. Which isn't to say it's like anti-human, but it's certainly authoritarian.
Yes, well, certainly Pius XII felt much more comfortable with authoritarian regimes than he did with democracies, particularly in Catholic majority countries. And this was certainly true in Italy as well, that it took the dictator to come to favorable terms with the Vatican that would establish Vatican City and separation of church and state, put crucifixes in every Italian classroom and every Italian courtroom, which are still there today, and so on. So in fact, one of the kind of ironies of the relationship of the Vatican to the fascist regime is that the church came out ahead, you might say, as a result of it. And part of the controversy of Pius XII is coming out ahead meant trying to rewrite a history of collaboration with the fascist regime. But that was part of a larger rewriting of Italian history, not just by the church, but by Italians more generally, that they actually were all anti-fascist and were part of the Allied cause and not Hitler's cause during the war.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here, David, on this screen?
Yeah, so I mentioned, the war begins with the invasion of Poland in September 39, but Italy doesn't join in. However, in May and then into the beginning of June, you have the following spring, so 1940, you have the German invasion of the West, sweeping through Belgium and Netherlands, Luxembourg, and sweeping eventually into Paris very quickly, shocking everybody, including Mussolini. Everybody thought there was this, after World War I, if there were any German attack, it would be very, very slow. And so all were shocked by the collapse of especially the French military. And so Mussolini wanted to get a share of the spoils before it was too late. It looked like at the same time the British were their troops were being at Dunkirk driven out of the continent, that pretty soon Hitler was going to win, and Mussolini wanted to be part of the winning team. So on June 10th, 1940, he announces, despite the fact the Pope had been urging him not to do so, announces that Italy was waging war on Britain and France. And this was a very fateful decision, of course, for Italy.
A lot of Italians didn't want to go to war. I mean, it wasn't a given at all. That was a really
yes, that's true. First of all, Mussolini he portrayed himself as a peacemaker. That he was in a position to talk reason with both sides. That he had this great relationship with Hitler, who had always admired him. In fact, Mussolini had early on been Hitler's role model. So that he could be this kind of peaceful mediating figure. And this increased his popularity. The other thing to realize, Italians had no love for Germans. They'd just gone to war with Germany, of course, in World War I. Plus the Germans vaunting of their superior Aryan, racial superiority. Italians, if you were Sicilian, you knew he didn't have you in mind. And so the notion of risking your life to fight on the side of Hitler's troops was not popular in Italy. Of course, there were some exceptions of the avid fascists, but for the most part, it wasn't. And so here too, the question is, what role, once Mussolini announces the war, what role would the Pope play in the Vatican and the Church play now that Italy was at war?
So that's the question. I mean, tell us a little bit about what you found about that in your sleuthing.
Yeah, well, maybe before we get into the whitewashing of the history, what happens is the Pope is eager not to offend Catholics and their nationalist feelings wherever they may be, whether in Germany or in Italy. And so while he holds himself above the fray, says he must remain neutral, he can't take any sides in a war, he also, the Pope functions as the chief cleric for Italy. So unlike other countries which have a structure where the cardinal primate who kind of speaks for the church, in Italy it's just the Pope who also speaks not only for the universal church, but for the Italian church. And he basically gave the okay to the cardinals and bishops to support the Axis War for the Italians. And that would remain the case until the fall of Mussolini in July of 1943.
At which point Italy switches sides, yeah.
Yeah, well, then, so part of, when people ask me about what the position of the Pope is during the war, one of the things I think people don't keep in mind is things look differently for the Pope when he initially thought that Hitler was going to win the war than when he later begins to wonder whether Hitler's going to lose the war.
How is
So
that?
if you want to understand the Pope's actions, you need to realize that in 39, 40, 41, first half of 42, there was good reason. Most people probably would have thought that Hitler was going to win the war. And so the Pope had to strategize from his perspective in how do you position the church to survive a Nazi dominated Europe. Once it becomes clear that no, the fascists and the Nazis are going to lose the war, he's got a different problem, which is for a couple of decades, the church, now talking from kind of an Italian point of view, had allied itself with Mussolini and the fascist regime. Now it's got to kind of rebrand itself as in a different way. So there's an attempt to early on to make a great popular hero of the Pope to kind of displace their previous popular hero, which was Mussolini.
That's an amazing kind of, maneuvering. Yeah, and this is, Pamela, where are we in the slides?
Yeah, I'll put it back up. I just wanted to give David a chance to talk.
No, absolutely.
Let me just to explain this. I mentioned earlier that to understand this attempt to kind of rewrite papal history in the war, you have to understand the larger context. It involved Italy as well. But here, this slide, just showing something very recent. So just in the weeks leading up to the recent opening of the archives, you had this spate of articles in the Italian press with this heroic image of the Pope as anti-fascist, the Pope as great savior of the Jews, and so on. So here, and what's particularly interesting about this article, this newspaper is the main kind of center-left newspaper in Italy, which some of the listeners will recognize, La Repubblica. And it's this article that the new archives are going to show that, in fact, the Mussolini and the fascist regime worked hard to prevent Eugenio Pacelli from being elected Pope in 1939. But in fact, the opposite is true, because you're not going to find out what Mussolini was trying to do from the Vatican archives. You'll find out from the fascist archives, which are already open, where I've spent years working. And there we have the correspondence of the Italian ambassador to the Holy See, who recounts his daily efforts with the cardinals to lobby on behalf of Eugenio Pacelli to get him elected. And not just that, but recounts his frequent meetings with the German ambassador to the Holy See, who's working with the German cardinals for the same purpose.
That's fascinating. And I think, yeah, the whitewashing is definitely part of the picture about, the people who want to make him a saint. But can I just steer you back to one of the questions that I think is really one of the fundamental ones about, like, the Holocaust is happening. You were talked about this a little bit before about Poland. I'm going to bring you back to Poland, but can we understand a little bit more about, when the Pope kind of becomes aware of what's happening to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust, and how, what that kind of, how that affects his thinking, and what he actually, what we know about what he does and doesn't say. I think your point earlier about him not speaking out against Hitler because he didn't want to go against the Catholics in Germany and Austria is a fascinating fundamental point. But bring us to, like, the heart of the dark heart of this war, and tell us a little bit, like, what's the issue here? Like, what was he aware of? What did he say, and what didn't he say?
Well, in terms of what he knew about the Holocaust, the Pope was getting reports from churchmen in Germany and in German-occupied Europe, from the beginning, and including, for example, their memoirs of a Roman priest who is a chaplain with the Italian forces fighting in 41, 42 on the Russian front. And he met with the Pope a number of times and brought with him prepared for the Pope a multi-page document recounting the mass murder of the Jews. They're being put on trains, they're being made to dig ditches, and hundreds of them then shot and thrown into ditches and so on. Plus various monsignors, various senior members of the church from occupied Europe were sending in reports lamenting and describing the fate of the Jews, along with other depredations of the Nazi forces. So the Pope was very well informed and knew early on, and some of the controversy is, in fact, more recently is about the fact that when the Pope was asked by President Roosevelt, essentially, whether he had any information that could confirm reports that were coming into the U.S. State Department about the Holocaust, and the Pope responded, no, he couldn't, that they were getting reports, but he couldn't verify any of them.
That's remarkable, David. I've never heard that before.
Was that kind of, we have the information, we don't want to tell you, or we don't have the information?
Well, I think his response was kind of ambiguous. Yes, we're getting some reports along these lines, but we're not really sure of the veracity of the sources, and so we really couldn't say.
Even if there were sources from Monsignors and from Catholic.
Yeah, he was getting reports from a priest in Rome who was eyewitness, for example, firsthand reports. So Pope had these reports, but didn't want to be in a position of verifying them for the U.S. or for the Allies, that this would somehow put him on the side of the Allies, which he wanted to avoid.
Because he wanted to stay neutral in that way. But, neutrality is also a moral stance.
Yes, well, people, of course, will argue that. He would argue that he was working in quiet ways. The Vatican did pursue, you might say, a Red Cross kind of strategy of working to get information on POWs, visiting POW camps where they could, and in other ways trying to offer humanitarian aid during the war. And so he would say, if I do anything that'll really annoy Hitler too much, they won't allow us that access anymore. And so things will just be worse off.
Do we ever have a sense of, did this Pope ever kind of capture the enormity or comprehend the enormity of what the Holocaust was?
I think, one thing that's notable there, although people don't seem to talk about it much, is what did the Pope have to say about the Holocaust and what had happened to the Jews of Europe after the war? Okay, so now there's no pressure. And the answer is nothing, as far as I know, and I've been watching this for many years. He never spoke out publicly about the Holocaust or about the fate of Europe's Jews. And so it just was, certainly, as you mentioned earlier, he was not happy about what happened to the Jews. Although the church had long held that Jews shouldn't be teaching Christian children, and Jews and Christians should be kept separate and so forth, and vilified Jews for the presumed killing of Jesus and crucifixion. The church obviously had never called for murdering the Jews, and the Pope was not happy about that, even less so because it put him on a difficult position. But and this to me is rather striking, that even after the war, it was not a matter that concerned him, much less looking at whether the church bore any responsibility. It's because one thing I haven't mentioned is, if you look at Italy, but also Germany, their campaigns to vilify the Jews, to justify what they were doing during the Holocaust and during World War II, they were relying heavily on church sources to do it. This was especially evident in Italy, where they were saying, look, the popes for centuries had thought Jews needed to be separated from Christians, and that Jews were an evil influence on healthy European Christian societies. So these were hammered. For example, Mussolini's daily newspaper, hammered on this all the time. And so I think there is some reckoning with responsibility that the Vatican needs to do. And in fact, John Paul II, for this reason, because of these kinds of criticisms, called on his commission for relations with the Jews to come up with a report. Did the church bear any responsibility for the demonization of the Jews that led to the Holocaust? And that led to, I think it was 1998 report called We Remember. Anybody that's interested, I'm sure you can Google We Remember and find the text, which denies that the church had any responsibility for the anti-Semitism that could have led to the Holocaust.
David, have you gotten a sense that there were people around the Pope on an ongoing basis during the war who were pushed? Was there some conflict within the church, or is it really hierarchical in the sense that the Pope's position was going to be the Vatican's whole position?
Well, of the people around the Pope in terms of prelates, as opposed to ambassadors like the Polish ambassador, but the prelates around the church, I'd say the main ones pressing him in the direction of speaking out were the French, or a couple of the French prelates, most notably Cardinal Tisserand. He was the only non-Italian cardinal. The other thing to understand is the Curia at the time, the central office of the Vatican, is almost entirely Italian. There's one exception, this French cardinal, Tisserand, and he is not happy with the Pope's silence and had been trying to prevail on the Pope to speak out, but does not succeed.
And we have the picture here about the archives. We have some excellent questions also from participants. But to get back to the archives, I mean, it sounds like there's so much material, and there's also it's not so easily black and white, and there's also a climate of anti-Semitism and a history of it, and then there's the diplomatic issues. And you've looked at so many of the other archives. To you at this point in your research, and I want to ask you actually before we go to questions how you came to this topic, but do you feel like what are the big questions left for you to answer that you hope that these archives might reveal?
Well, first of all, just one note. You recall that the Pope is Pope till 1958, so it's not that at the end of the war he's no longer Pope. And in fact, the period right after World War II is a very dramatic one for Europe, with the beginning of the Cold War, Italy, Germany largely destroyed, much of Europe in ruins. And the Pope plays a crucial political role, but a kind of secret one, especially in Italy, in keeping the communists from coming to power. This was the big fear of the Vatican at the time, not just of the Vatican. So in terms of what we can find out, what may be the biggest secrets, the biggest surprises, the biggest novelties coming out of these archives, it may in fact be the period after World War II, not during World War II.
David, could you tell us what we're seeing here in this slide?
Yes, I think we're seeing well, on the left, you see this courtyard, is the Belvedere courtyard, which is in the bowels of Vatican City. And if you look kind of straight ahead, you see where the two wings of the building come together. If you look just at the right, that doorway, go over to the right, and obviously for the ground floor, near where the two wings come together, that's the entry to what had been called the Vatican Secret Archive, and which the Pope recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Next to it on the right is actually the Vatican Library, the Biblioteca Apostolica. What you see on the right is us in front of that door. So they were going to open at 8:30 on Monday morning, March 2nd, for the first time for the papacy of Pius XII. And I found there this large group of Germans. There were no other Americans that I saw the week I was there, and a certain number of Italians. But you had 7, I think there's 6 of them here. There was the group of Professor Wolff. He may be the most prominent European historian of the church during this period. And he's just in a position to bring a lot of his associates with him, so they were working away. I think the next slide, just to give you an idea of where this is, I'm sure many people watching have been to Vatican City, certainly been to St. Peter's, which you see there, along with the Bernini Colonnade, St. Peter's Square. To get to the archive, you go to the right of where the colonnade is, and you see that arrow pointing to Sant'Anna Gate, and there will be 2 Swiss Guard, one on either side, as you pass by and show your pass, because you need a pass to get in here. And you go straight up, and then you see ahead that Belvedere courtyard. That's what you just saw a picture of me in with my German colleagues. On one side of it, it says the library, but actually it's the library is on the right, but on the left is the Vatican Apostolic Archive or Secret Archive. On the other side of that courtyard, I have an arrow pointing to where the archive of the Secretary of State is, which is also important for this research. Just to give you an idea of the fact there are other, one last thing on that, the Holy Office of the Inquisition Archive, the building of the that housed the Inquisition for centuries is right there on the other side of St. Peter's. And to go in that archive, there's a separate entrance, a whole separate procedure. So that's where I've been working anyway.
So we could do a whole, like, how to get into the archive. And they have the best cappuccino, cheapest cappuccino in Rome in the Vatican.
Right, they do, yeah.
But
so here,
yeah, before we get to questions, David, please tell us how you came to this subject, which has been so much of your life's work.
Yes, well, it's been so much of my life's work actually in the most recent decades, but something I didn't originally set out to do. I'd done other kind of Italian research, but not on this kind of history. However, as a child, I heard stories from my father. So my father was a rabbi and was a chaplain in the US Army during World War II. And he would tell stories of being with the troops at Anzio. Anzio is one of the places the US landed troops trying to liberate Italy and Rome from the Nazis in 1944. And this is a shot, it's actually was published in the New York Times. This one is taken from Look magazine of my father. That's my father there, the rabbi leading this service with the GIs. They're actually in a wine cellar under bombardment, German bombardment during this service. And then they finally break out. They're pinned down by the Germans for a number of months. Finally, the beginning of June, the troops are able on June 4th to liberate Rome. So obviously a very dramatic day, but especially dramatic day for the Jews of Rome because they've been in hiding. Thousands of them have been sent to their death at Auschwitz already. And if you look at the next slide is a portrait that also appeared in the paper on June 9th. So 5 days, it was a Sunday that Rome was liberated. That Friday night, they opened up the synagogue for the first time, the great temple of Rome, which you see portrayed there on the right. And the place is packed for the first service. The surviving Jews of Rome come out for this dramatic occasion of seeing which of their friends and family are still alive. And a magazine captured this scene. So my father was co-conducting this as representing the Allied forces there and the Jews of the Allied forces. And so he's co-conducting with the chief rabbi of Rome. When, before the service, an American GI came up to him and said he was from the Roman Jewish community. He had presumably been sent out as a child when the racial laws were enacted in 1938, the anti-Semitic laws, had joined the army, was back there fighting for the liberation of Rome, but he didn't know whether his mother had survived the war. And so he asked my father, could you make an announcement? And my father said, well, it's a little awkward. You know, there's so many people who want to know about loved ones. But why don't you stand next to me at the beginning of the service? And I'm sure if your mother is here, she'll recognize you. In fact, that's what happens. At the beginning of the service, the GI stands up next to my father, and there's this shriek from the pews, and this woman rushes up to embrace her son. So it was a dramatic moment for many.
That's a hugely moving story, and also how you came to this. We have so many, there's so much material here, and we have a bunch of really excellent questions, which I'd like to get to. And many of the questions are kind of about what lessons we can draw from the Vatican's relationship or the Pope Pius XII's relationship to Mussolini and during the Second World War, and whether we can draw lessons from that about how, we have a question from Mira Kamdar, who's a fellow journalist and columnist, author friend here in Paris, who says that it's important to understand the affinity between religious leaders and institutions and authoritarian regimes. So are there any lessons from Pius XII and Mussolini to what we're seeing now in India and the United States and other countries?
Yeah, Poland, for example. Well, I do think there are. For one thing, we see the attraction for certain religious leaders of a strong leader who's willing to make a deal with them. I'll give you what you want as long as you support me, and forget about kind of moral questions and so on. And I obviously see that with the not just Pius XII, but his predecessor Pius XII and the Vatican and their relationship with Mussolini. But certainly, as I look at some of the evangelical and other Christian leaders in the U.S., their relationship with our president. Some similarities certainly come to mind. But also, if we look at how the church confronted the sex, what's called the sex scandal, it brings up some similar issues for the church. That is, how do you judge between protecting the institution of the church as you see it and maintaining the moral standing of the church and its leaders? And in that sense, I think the quandary that Pius XII faced was not maybe dissimilar from, let's say, John Paul II in protecting some of the people he protected, which later proved disastrous, I think, for the church.
It's a question of the church as an institution and the church as the flock and the faithful. And when the tide turns and the faithful feel like they're being harmed, then, then that's different than, yeah. But it's a huge power structure, the church. We have some other questions about did, after John Paul II's commission, and we remember documented, the Vatican create any policies to prevent future collaborations between repressive and fascist regimes and the Vatican? That's a question from Sapna.
Not that I'm aware of. So, I mean, one should say, just not to leave any doubt, that the church position with respect to the Jews changed dramatically with the Second Vatican Council. And so what we're talking about is, in some sense, ancient history, I guess. But in terms of, the church has long taken the position, we will work with any regime as long as they will work in a collaborative manner with us to deal with our kind of institutional needs. And that it's not up to us to judge what kind of government any particular country should have. This was certainly a position that Pius XII often especially told the Germans, that he had publicly pronounced that he wasn't taking a position on whether their government was better or worse than any other government. That wasn't the job of the Pope. And I think that actually probably remains true, even though probably Pope Francis would say, there's certain kind of moral principles that he's going to pronounce for everybody. But I don't believe that's come to the point where he said, therefore, government X, Y, and Z is no good.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting also in the history of church history, kind of veering between progressives and more traditionalists. And that's something that we see with this papacy and with the opening. The archives were opened under Francis's papacy. There's also a question from a reader about whether there are any huge surprises that you found in your 5 days in the archives, or whether it kind of confirms a little bit of what you of the era.
Well, there were, yes. I mean, I'm a little reluctant, only being there 5 days to, announce some big scoop, sensationalist scoop that I found. I mean, I did find some things, including a report prepared by the Vatican Secretary of State office, actually by someone who would be the future Cardinal Vicar of Rome, shortly after 1,000 Jews from Roman ghetto were sent to Auschwitz in the latter part of 1943. And it was, a really viciously anti-Semitic document, I thought. But on the other hand, I also found an interesting piece by having to do with the Pope. He was asked by one of the daily Catholic newspapers, and the Catholic press throughout the war were pronouncing it a holy crusade for defending Christian Europe. All the more so once the Soviet Union became an enemy in 1941. And so the leading Catholic daily newspaper asked the Pope for what normally would be just a common ritual, namely give his blessing to the leaders of the newspaper, the editors of the paper. And what I discovered in my few days there was that the Pope said, no, I'm not going to, because the paper is so filled with this Axis propaganda that I don't want my name associated with it. So at the same time, it's interesting, you call it a kind of double game, that at the same time as the Pope was allowing the church to represent itself this way through a Catholic press that the church hierarchy of Italy was urging all good Catholics to read and follow, he needed to keep himself in a position so he wouldn't be personally compromised.
David, you're someone who challenges the traditional narrative of the mainstream narrative that the church wants to get out. you've done that for years. You've sort of been somebody who goes. So I'm just curious what your relationship is like with the Vatican, and they let you in on day one. How do you navigate those politics?
Well, I must say I'm grateful to the archivists at the Vatican for letting me in. I mean, they've taken the position that serious scholars should be allowed in. It's not their job to, just let in people who have certain political perspectives, and I respect that, and I'm grateful for it. I think one thing you quickly learn if you work in the Vatican is that there's not the Vatican. There are just a lot of different perspectives. Rachel, who covered the Vatican for the Times, and I'm sure knows this well.
Like saying U.S. government, like who?
Yeah, so, there are people there who will kind of more or less whisper in my ear, really, I read something you wrote recently, I thought it was great. But there are others who are very defensive and occasionally hostile. But so far, I really personally can't complain, and I'm grateful to the Vatican for allowing me and other scholars in.
Well, we are so grateful to you, David, for being here today and for sharing the fruits of not only decades of work, but also 5 full days in the formerly secret archives. And thank you, Rachel, also for being here. And it was a beautiful discussion. I was so glad that the two of you Americans could get together and talk about Italy in front of what seems to be a bunch of Italians in the audience, as well as many other people from around the world.